When people think of ancient Rome, they often imagine glorious emperors, epic gladiator battles, and grand monuments that still stand today. But behind that dazzling facade existed a much darker reality, one that was lived by countless young male slaves whose lives were marked by fear, suffering, and unimaginable cruelty. Stripped of freedom, family, and dignity, these boys were treated as property, forced into brutal labor, and subjected to punishments that reveal the terrifying underbelly of Rome's so-called Golden Age. Today, we peel back the layers of Roman history to uncover the hidden truth about what life was like for young male slaves in one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. The capture and enslavement of boys, many young male slaves in Rome, did not begin their lives within its walls. They were taken from conquered territories. Rome expanded its empire through relentless wars, and as soldiers marched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they captured children as part of the spoils of war. These boys, often between the ages of 8 and 16, were torn from their families and transported to slave markets where their value was assessed like livestock. Their youth made them highly desirable, young enough to be molded, trained, and exploited for decades of service. Once captured, their identities were erased, replaced with new names given by Roman masters. They were stripped of citizenship rights and placed under the absolute control of their owners. For many, this sudden transition from childhood innocence to slavery was disorienting and traumatic. What made it worse was the sheer uncertainty. Boys never knew if they would be sent into hard labor, sold into a household, or trained for the deadly life of gladiators. The loss of freedom was only the beginning of a far more terrifying ordeal. The slave markets of Rome. Upon capture, young boys were brought to the bustling slave markets of Rome, where they were displayed for buyers like goods in a marketplace. These markets were infamous for their brutality. Boys were stripped nearly naked to show their physical condition, examined by potential owners for signs of strength, health, and obedience. Auctioneers shouted out their skills or possible uses, whether the boy was fit for domestic work, farm labor, or gladiatorial training. Wealthy Romans sought younger boys for household duties, while others purchased them for back-breaking agricultural labor. Some were bought by brothel owners, where their lives descended into unspeakable exploitation. Prices varied depending on age, health, and origin, with certain foreign boys considered more exotic and thus more valuable. The experience of being sold was deeply humiliating, and from that moment forward, a boy's life was dictated entirely by the will of his master. The slave market was not just a place of commerce, but a stage where children lost their autonomy forever, with no hope of return to the families and homelands from which they had been stolen. Brutal conditions in Roman households. Young male slaves placed in Roman households often endured harsh living conditions. At first glance, one might assume household work was preferable to hard labor in the fields, but the reality was still grim. Boys were expected to perform endless chores, cleaning, cooking, serving meals, and even assisting their masters with personal grooming. Mistakes, no matter how small, were met with swift and severe punishment, ranging from whippings to beatings. Household slaves had no privacy and were often made to sleep in cramped, dark quarters, sometimes near kitchens or storerooms. They were constantly monitored, and disobedience could mean being chained or sold to harsher environments. For wealthy families, boys were also used as personal attendants for children or even as entertainment for guests. This constant subservience eroded their sense of identity, leaving them trapped in cycles of fear and humiliation. Even though they lived close to the wealth and comfort of Roman elites, they were always reminded that they themselves were considered property, disposable and replaceable, no matter how loyal or hardworking they proved to be. Life in agricultural labor camps. For many young slaves, their fate was far worse than domestic service. Those sent to agricultural estates, known as latifundia, faced backbreaking labor from dawn until dusk. Boys were forced to work alongside adults, enduring the same grueling demands despite their age. They plowed fields, carried heavy loads, and tended crops in scorching heat or bitter cold, often with little food or water. Overseers known as vilici enforced discipline with whips, ensuring no slave rested without permission. Unlike household slaves, agricultural slaves lived in filthy, overcrowded barracks where disease spread quickly. Escape was nearly impossible due to constant surveillance and the severe punishments that awaited runaways. For young boys, this environment was especially terrifying as they had no childhood left, only a daily struggle to survive under relentless toil. Many died young from exhaustion, malnutrition, or beatings. These agricultural labor camps were the hidden backbone of Rome's wealth, producing grain, olives, and wine for the empire, but they consumed countless young lives in the process. The suffering of these boys was invisible to most citizens, who enjoyed the fruits of their labor without questioning the human cost. Training as gladiators, some boys were purchased specifically for the gladiatorial schools, known as ludi, where they were trained to fight and die for the entertainment of Rome. While gladiators are often romanticized in popular culture, for young slaves it was a nightmare existence. These boys were forced into a brutal regimen of combat training, discipline, and deprivation. They lived under constant threat of violence, not only from their trainers, but also from the deadly contests they were preparing to enter. Boys as young as 12 were sometimes placed in the arena, expected to face older, stronger opponents or even wild animals. Death was a frequent outcome, but survival did not guarantee freedom. It simply meant more fights and more bloodshed. Gladiatorial schools instilled fear and obedience through whippings and cruel punishments for disobedience. Even if a boy survived years in the arena, the chance of earning freedom through victory was slim. To the Roman public, gladiators were heroes, but behind the spectacle was the tragic story of enslaved children forced into violence, robbed of choice, and used as pawns in Rome's culture of cruelty and spectacle. Psychological torment and loss of identity. The life of a young male slave in Rome was not only physically demanding, but also psychologically devastating. From the moment of capture, boys were stripped of their names and given new ones by their masters, severing their connection to their families and cultures. They were taught to see themselves as objects, constantly reminded that they were inferior to Roman citizens. This psychological conditioning was reinforced daily through punishment, humiliation, and the denial of personal autonomy. Some boys were deliberately isolated from others to prevent them from forming bonds or plotting escape, while others were forced to watch executions of disobedient slaves to instill fear. Over time, many young slaves lost their sense of identity entirely, becoming shadows of who they once were. The constant reminder that they were property, combined with the absence of hope for freedom, created deep emotional scars. These scars were invisible compared to whippings or bruises, but were just as damaging, ensuring that even those who survived physically were left broken in spirit. Rome's grandeur was built on this silent suffering, with young boys carrying burdens too heavy for any child to bear. Punishments and the fear of death. Discipline in ancient Rome was harsh, and young male slaves were no exception to the brutality. Even minor mistakes, such as spilling food or failing to respond quickly, could lead to severe punishments. Whippings were common, but in more extreme cases, boys were branded with hot irons or mutilated to prevent escape. The most terrifying punishment of all was execution, often carried out publicly to serve as a warning. Runaway slaves who were recaptured faced crucifixion, one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. Others were forced into gladiatorial combat as punishment, essentially being thrown to death in the arena. Living under this constant threat of pain and death created an atmosphere of terror. Slaves quickly learned that their survival depended entirely on obedience and submission, though even this offered no guarantee of safety. The fear was not only physical but psychological. Young boys grew up knowing they had no rights, no voice, and no control over their own fate. Every day was a battle to avoid punishment, but in Rome's system of cruelty, fear itself was the ultimate tool of control. The rare paths to freedom. Though rare, some young male slaves managed to secure freedom, offering a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. This process, known as manumission, could occur in a few ways. Loyal slaves might be freed in their master's will. Others could purchase their own freedom after years of saving small allowances, and some were granted liberty as a reward for bravery or exceptional service. Freed slaves, known as liberti, gained certain legal rights and could work for wages, though they were never considered equal to Roman-born citizens. For boys who had endured years of hardship, freedom was both liberating and challenging, as they had to navigate a society that still viewed them with suspicion. Many remained tied to their former masters as clients, obligated to provide service in exchange for protection. Despite these limitations, the chance of freedom provided a faint light in the darkness. It was a reminder that survival, obedience, and luck could, in the rarest of circumstances, transform a life of suffering into one of cautious independence. Yet for the vast majority, freedom remained an unattainable dream. Gladiatorial training and forced combat. Many young male slaves in ancient Rome were forced into gladiatorial schools known as ludi, where their lives became training grounds for blood sport. These boys, often no older than 16, endured brutal conditioning designed to strip away their humanity and transform them into fighting machines. Beatings, starvation, and merciless drills were routine. Unlike free soldiers who fought for honor, gladiator slaves had no choice. They were forced to battle for the entertainment of Roman crowds, often against animals or seasoned warriors. Death was not only likely, it was expected. Those who survived a few matches might earn temporary fame, but it came at the cost of constant fear and physical torment. Many young boys died in training before they even reached the arena. The thought of knowing their life would end as public spectacle haunted them daily. Even for those who managed to live through several combats, the promise of freedom was rare. The empire fed on their blood, turning their stolen youth into entertainment for masses who never questioned the cruelty. Domestic slavery in elite Roman homes. Not every young male slave was sent to fight in arenas. Many were absorbed into the households of Rome's elite. Life inside a patrician household was no less terrifying. Young boys became personal attendants to masters, often treated as living possessions rather than humans. They were forced to wake before dawn, light fires, clean, serve meals, and follow their owners' every command without hesitation. Any mistake, even something as minor as spilling wine or failing to bow low enough, could lead to severe beatings. Beyond physical abuse, these boys endured psychological domination, stripped of their identities and sometimes even their names. Many were renamed by their masters to reinforce the loss of self. While some historians claim domestic slaves were better off than gladiators, the constant fear of punishment and lack of autonomy made their existence suffocating. They lived in shadows, serving the whims of their owners, unable to dream of futures for themselves. Their childhood was consumed by obedience, humiliation, and dependency, with the constant knowledge that they could be sold away at any moment, tearing them from the only connections they had. Sexual exploitation and loss of innocence. One of the most disturbing realities for young male slaves in ancient Rome was sexual exploitation. Roman culture permitted masters to use their slaves in any way they desired, and boys were often seen as vulnerable prey. Many were forced into degrading roles, serving not only as attendants, but also as objects of sexual gratification for their owners. This abuse stripped them of innocence and dignity, leaving long-lasting trauma that could not be healed. In a society that openly tolerated such practices, there was no justice or recourse for the victims. Their suffering was silenced, dismissed as part of the institution of slavery. Some boys were even sold specifically for this purpose, auctioned to wealthy buyers who sought to indulge in their darkest desires. The constant threat of such exploitation meant that no safe place existed for these children. Even in the privacy of a household, they were vulnerable. The loss of childhood innocence was not a rare tragedy, but a widespread reality for enslaved boys. Their existence became one of constant fear, shame, and a stolen identity in a society that normalized their abuse. The crushing weight of Roman punishments for enslaved boys in Rome were merciless and often designed to instill fear rather than correct behavior. Whipping was common, but far from the worst. Some were branded with hot irons, permanently marking them as property, stripping them of identity, and serving as constant reminders of their servitude. Others were subjected to torture or forced labor under brutal conditions if accused of disobedience. The punishments were disproportionate, as a minor mistake could be treated as rebellion. Worst of all, if one slave committed a crime, entire groups within a household could be executed in collective punishment. Young boys were forced to witness the deaths of peers and sometimes even participate in carrying out cruel tasks, embedding terror into their psyche. The Roman legal system offered no protection. Slaves were legally considered property, not people. This meant punishments could escalate to death with no consequences for the master. Living under constant surveillance and the looming shadow of harsh retribution, enslaved boys developed an internalized fear that made survival itself their only focus. They were crushed into submission through calculated cruelty. Labor in the fields and mines, while many young male slaves worked in homes or trained as gladiators, others were sent to Rome's fields and mines, where conditions were nothing short of deadly. Agricultural labor meant long hours under the scorching sun, with boys forced to plow fields, haul water, and harvest crops far beyond their strength. They were given minimal food and rest, often collapsing from exhaustion. Yet their suffering in the fields paled compared to the horrors of the mines. Underground, boys endured suffocating heat, toxic air, and constant risk of collapse. Many never saw daylight again, their bodies withering away in darkness. The mortality rate was staggering, and few survived long enough to escape such assignments. Unlike gladiators, who could occasionally win a crowd's admiration, field and mine slaves had no audience and no recognition. Their labor built the wealth of Rome in silence, and their deaths went unnoticed. For these boys, existence meant relentless physical pain with no hope of freedom. Their youth was consumed entirely by backbreaking work that left scars on their bodies and stripped away the possibility of a future. Fear of being sold and torn apart from companions. For young male slaves, the threat of being sold at any time was an invisible chain that bound them even when daily tasks were less punishing. Masters frequently traded slaves like commodities, and boys could be separated from friends or surrogate families with no warning. This instability created constant emotional turmoil, as bonds formed among enslaved children were often ripped apart without mercy. At auctions, boys were displayed like merchandise, inspected physically and humiliated before strangers who decided their fate with a simple purchase. For those already traumatized by servitude, being sold meant starting the cycle of fear and abuse all over again, often in harsher environments. The anxiety of never belonging anywhere became part of their identity. Even in rare moments of companionship, the looming threat of sale hung heavily. Unlike free Roman children who grew up with security, enslaved boys learned from an early age that nothing in their world was permanent. Their lives were fragile, controlled by the whims of others, and defined by the constant fear of losing what little connection or stability they had. The burden of obedience and submission. Obedience was the single expectation pressed upon enslaved boys, enforced with relentless severity. They were trained from their earliest years to anticipate commands, bow their heads, and never question authority. This constant submission crushed individuality, stripping them of the ability to think or act freely. Many were forced to adopt submissive body language, walking with lowered eyes and speaking only when addressed. Disobedience, even unintentional, meant punishment. So enslaved children lived in a state of hyper-vigilance. Over time, this psychological burden created deep scars. Boys learned to suppress emotions, silence their desires, and bury their own sense of identity. To survive, they had to become shadows of themselves, living only as extensions of their masters. Unlike free Roman youths who explored education, philosophy, and the promise of adulthood, enslaved boys were denied all opportunities to grow as individuals. The crushing expectation of obedience did not just control their actions, it reshaped their minds. They were molded into tools of service, their humanity disregarded, their voices erased, and their lives consumed by the heavy weight of enforced submission. Psychological trauma and the loss of hope, the combination of violence, exploitation, and fear left young male slaves in Rome with deep psychological trauma that often went unspoken. Growing up in a world where beatings, humiliation, and death were normal destroyed their ability to hope for a better future. Many developed a numbness, detaching emotionally as a survival mechanism. Others lived with constant anxiety, terrified of punishments or separation from companions. The lack of freedom, combined with the daily reminder of their status as property, stripped them of self-worth. Unlike free Roman children, who could aspire to careers in politics, the military, or philosophy, enslaved boys were denied dreams. Their childhood was a void filled only with labor, fear, and servitude. Even when rare opportunities for manumission or freedom were dangled before them, the chances were slim. Most knew they would die in chains, unremembered and unmourned. The psychological scars were passed down through silence as their stories were rarely told. In the terrifying lives of these boys, hope was not simply lost. It was stolen by a system built on cruelty and the denial of their humanity. The brutality of mining labor, one of the most terrifying fates for young male slaves in ancient Rome, was being sent to the mines. These environments were considered a living death sentence. Roman mines produced precious metals and salt, but at an unimaginable human cost. Young boys were chained and forced to work in cramped, airless tunnels for hours that stretched from dawn until darkness. They endured backbreaking labor while inhaling toxic dust that scarred their lungs permanently. Food rations were meager, just enough to keep them alive, and water was often scarce. Overseers punished even the smallest hesitation with brutal whippings. The danger was constant collapses, suffocation, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Because replacements were cheap, their lives were seen as expendable. Unlike other slaves who had some contact with Roman households, miners were entirely cut off from society, treated more like tools than humans. Survivors were rare, and those who did live long enough were permanently disfigured or disabled. For young male slaves, being condemned to the mines was the harshest reminder that their lives were valued less than the minerals they extracted from the earth. Slaves in Roman bathhouses, although bathhouses symbolized luxury for Roman citizens, for slaves they represented humiliation and servitude. Young male slaves were frequently employed in these social hubs, attending to the bathing rituals of the wealthy elite. Their duties included heating massive furnaces to provide hot water, scrubbing down the bodies of masters, massaging their muscles, and maintaining cleanliness in the sprawling facilities. Many had to remain on constant standby, ready to serve at the snap of a finger. This work, though less deadly than the mines, was demeaning because it stripped them of privacy and dignity. They were expected to appear cheerful while performing intimate services, often enduring ridicule or harassment. Bathhouses were also centers of gossip and political exchange, but slaves had to remain silent and invisible, forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. A mistake could result in harsh punishment, as masters would not tolerate embarrassment in a public setting. For these boys, life in the bathhouse revealed the stark divide of Roman society, while elites soaked in luxury. The slaves who enabled that comfort were trapped in cycles of endless labor and social invisibility. Forced participation in gladiatorial schools. Gladiatorial combat is often glamorized in modern retellings, but for young male slaves who were thrown into gladiatorial schools, it was a life of violence and despair. Boys who showed physical potential were sometimes trained from a young age in the brutal art of combat. Their days consisted of punishing drills, weapon training, and physical conditioning, all while enduring harsh discipline from trainers. They were kept in harsh conditions, treated less as humans and more as investments for the bloody spectacles of the arena. While some might dream of glory, the majority dreaded the inevitable fights that awaited them. Even training could be fatal, as accidents were common and punishments severe. Few gladiators ever earned freedom, and the promise of manumission was dangled as bait to ensure obedience. For many young boys, being forced into gladiatorial life meant being robbed of childhood and condemned to entertain crowds with their suffering. Each day they faced the prospect of death, not just at the hands of opponents, but also from starvation, disease, or mistreatment. It was a cruel transformation of slaves into tools for public amusement and political power. Household intimacies and abuse. Inside Roman households, young male slaves often lived in close proximity to their masters, serving as attendants, messengers, or personal aides. While some tasks were relatively safe, the intimacy of this environment exposed them to a different kind of danger: abuse. They were at constant risk of being humiliated, beaten, or even exploited in ways that robbed them of dignity. Masters had absolute control over their bodies and lives, and no law protected them from mistreatment. For many young slaves, nights could be just as terrifying as the labor of the day, because their vulnerability was ever present. Additionally, the demand for obedience in personal service meant they were never free from scrutiny. A spilled cup of wine, a slow response, or even a perceived gesture of disrespect could result in whipping or branding. The psychological toll of this environment was immense, as many lived with the fear of unpredictable violence. Even in wealthy, refined households, life was not easier for these boys. It was a different arena of cruelty, where they were always reminded that their lives were disposable extensions of their masters' whims. The fear of being sold away. For young male slaves, stability was an illusion because at any moment they could be sold away. Slave markets were common across Rome, and human lives were traded as casually as livestock. Boys could be torn from familiar surroundings, separated from friends, or even from family members who had also been enslaved. The trauma of being sold was profound, because it erased any fragile sense of belonging they may have developed.